Backyard Wrestling, Don't Try This at Home, is a 2003 wrestling sim that only took 10 months to develop and had multiple leadership changes in its short time. It may seem like an obscure game, but many of us have memories of either renting this or going over a buddy's house to play it because our mom didn't let us have it. If you were a bit older, you might have been introduced to Backyard Wrestling and the characters in this game by staying up late and watching late night TV that always had questionable commercials. Before we talk about the extreme development of Backyard Wrestling, Don't Try This at Home, we need to first make a few pit stops and understand what Backyard Wrestling really is. Backyard Wrestling started in the late 90s and really gained popularity in the early 2000s. It was usually a sort of deathmatch wrestling that instead of focusing on the ring and the wrestlers, the focus was on blood, guts, and weapons. Rings were usually old mattresses or tires, and nothing was off limits. Behind Backyard Wrestling was Backyard Wrestling Incorporated, which was founded by Rick Mayer and Houston Curtis. I believe these two were an important part to the video game Backyard Wrestling that we all know and love today. They took something that had no purpose being a business and turned it into an empire. Because they were the businessmen behind the IP of Backyard Wrestling, there was an opportunity to take these people killing themselves for the love of wrestling and turn it into a money-making spectacle. Now when I say money-making, I don't even mean that the wrestlers were being paid well, because that for sure wasn't happening. However, because there was a business side to Backyard Wrestling, there was an opportunity for money to be made, which is what I believe Rick and Houston saw from the beginning. The start of their money came from DVD and VHS sales in the very early 2000s. Marketing for these tapes usually occurred late at night on television and was usually ran on channels like Comedy Central, Spike TV, or paid channels. If you were a kid staying up late and this came on, you were immediately captured. The DVD commercials included bikini-clad women and a crazy clip from each of the tapes they were marketing. Most of the time, these tapes would be a compilation video of all the crazy Backyard Wrestling clips from recent years. One of the compilations, titled The Best of Backyard Wrestling, Futures of the Ring, had, to my knowledge, the first time Backyard Wrestling the video game was advertised. The next pit stop is figuring out how from the late 90s to early 2000s, Backyard Wrestling became not only a popular DVD or VHS for kids who grew up in that era, but it was now on its way to becoming a popular video game for kids during that time too. Backyard Wrestling on paper is perfect for a video game. The characters, action, violence, and just over-the-top shenanigans really make it perfect for the video game screen. But how did we get these kids in their backyard to millions of other kids' television sets? Well, it was the DVD and VHS marketing. The story goes that Kevin Gill, senior project manager of Eidos, was brand new to the company and previously had purchased the Backyard Wrestling tapes at a Christmas party. During his first week at Eidos, the president, Rob Dyer, hosted a meeting announcing that Eidos has new funding and are looking for new game ideas. Kevin was afraid to speak up in this meeting, so after the meeting, Kevin went to the president of Eidos and pitched him the idea of a Backyard Wrestling video game. Eidos ate it up, and they immediately started to look for a developer for the idea. They eventually selected Paradox Development, who at the time were infamous for having Thrill Kill canceled on the PlayStation for being too violent. They were the perfect developers for Backyard Wrestling. It's important to note that at this time, in the very early 2000s, there was a targeted attack on the idea of Backyard Wrestling. News articles were being produced attempting to spread the news of this dangerous new form of wrestling, and even WWF, now WWE, superstars were coming out speaking against it. Eidos and Backyard Wrestling were prepared for the bad press, even so expecting it. The game has a shock factor to it when you first play, and for kids at that time, they ate it up and it was exactly what they wanted. I think that this article in particular is where they came up with the name for the game that would eventually come out. Alright, so back to video game development. At this point, we have Backyard Wrestling, an indie wrestling company headed by two businessmen and filled with a roster of characters ready to kill each other for the love of wrestling, and Kevin Gill, a higher up in the gaming industry with a love for wrestling and a want to create something new that the game world hasn't seen before. Fast forward to early 2002. Backyard Wrestling puts out one of their compilation videos, and this time it has an advertisement for Backyard Wrestling, the video game. I believe that at this point, Kevin Gill or someone from Eidos has contacted Rick Mayer or Houston Curtis, and it's a mutual agreement that at this point, Backyard Wrestling will be turned into a video game and Eidos will be publishing it. This is not known to the public at the time, but I believe the release of this video and this advertisement is the public's introduction to what would eventually become Backyard Wrestling. Don't try this at home. In December of 2002, it was officially announced that Eidos would be partnering with Backyard Wrestling Incorporated to create games using the Backyard Wrestling IP. Development has either begun or will be starting soon.
Rude Boy invented Backyard Wrestling.
At this point, things are starting to ramp up for Backyard Wrestling video game. Remember, the game went through only a 10-month development cycle. February and March of 2003 would be the public's first look at Backyard Wrestling, and the game finally began to gain its identity. In early February of 2002, GameSpot had its first hands-on experience with Backyard Wrestling, and this article is interesting. It's some of the very first media the public will see on what Backyard Wrestling is becoming. Now in this article, GameSpot compares Backyard Wrestling to a game called Power Stone, which is a great game playable on the Dreamcast. But I want everyone to keep this in mind. The game is not being compared to traditional wrestling games during development. This is important because I believe one of the reasons Backyard Wrestling received mediocre critic reviews is because upon its release it was compared to the WWE wrestling games out at the time, which are very different from a more arcade arena fighter like Power Stone. Going back to play through Backyard Wrestling for this video, I would agree more with the Power Stone comparison over any WWE game I've ever played. There are some WWE games that have behind-the-scene fights or street fights, but even those, the gameplay is very different and there's less of a focus on the environment and still a focus on just grappling and the moves that can be done by the wrestlers. Also, around this time in February, it was revealed that the Insane Clown Posse was involved and they themselves would be playable characters. I believe ICP became involved because at this time, they were hot shit. They just finished their first deck of Joker cards and probably have the most mainstream buzz of their entire career at this time. They also had something called Juggalo Championship Wrestling, which was a larger indie wrestling promotion. In 2002 and 2003, JCW was the second highest grossing wrestling promotion in the US. ICP at this point has also done stints in WCW, ECW, and even the WWF. In fact, before they were hip-hop icons, ICP wanted to be wrestlers, so it's in their blood. In February of 2002, Eidos announces their partnership with ICP. To some, the partnership might be a surprise, but man, this is a perfect match. ICP will be playable characters, and even some wrestlers from JCW, which already had a bigger name than Backyard Wrestling, will be playable too. I was able to find this clip on ICP's involvement and how Kevin Gill, the project manager of Eidos, was really the driver of this game, was the one to get them involved.
Well, Kevin Gill called us from Eidos, and Kevin Gill is the man. He's a juggalo.
The man.
See what I'm saying? It's like juggalos network out and hook each other up. But what Kevin Gill realized and brought to the table by asking us to be part of Backyard Wrestling, Kevin Gill knows that we are the most successful backyard wrestlers there is if you really look at it. Because check this out. Think about it. We ain't never been trained. We don't know shit. Just like everybody in the backyard. Yet, we still wrestled in the WWF. We wrestled in WCW twice.
ECW, XPW, any W there is. Put a W on it. We've been in that motherfucker, you know.
And independence. And the fact of the matter is, we don't know shit. We go out there and freestyle. just like in the backyard. So that makes us the most successful backyard wrestlers in history. And that Kevin Gill of Eidos recognized and invited us to be in the game. You know what I mean? We only had one stipulation, and our stipulation was we wanted our characters to be the toughest programmed and to be only, the toughest ones, and therefore that's what happens. So always remember that. Play our guys. We got the best advantage.
You always win.
That's
when you
actually
play
a lie.
Not so much.
Yeah, they made me weak.
But yeah, because you can tell by the guns right there.
Yeah, look at how thick they made him in part 2.
Well,
He's all
because look
cut
at
up.
that. I mean, look at that. You know what I'm saying? Just
Sweet.
grab again, but at the gowns.
Beautiful. Nice ink.
Look at that. That's what you call a 14-inch python right there. Okay? That's 14 inches of pure muscle. Okay?
Of pure cheeseburgers and beer.
Yeah. I mean, not so much cheeseburgers, but yeah.
In March of 2003, Electronic Games Monthly published their monthly magazine, and in this existed a 3-page overview of backyard wrestling, Don't Try This at Home, and included words directly from Kevin Gill on the idea and identification of developer. We learn here that Paradox Development would be leading development on this project, and it's fitting due to their current, at the time, infamous status with thrill kill and violent video games. We also hear directly from Backyard Wrestling Incorporated founders Rick Mayer and Houston Curtis on more details on how we got to this point. We hear about some upcoming gameplay features that included a pop and jeer system, which Paradox hopes will effectively keep players from using the same moves over and over again. I don't think this ever came to the game. I haven't found any sort of system reward that rewards move variety. There are parts to the game where audience members can throw something or a bystander can hit you if you come close, but I do not believe there's any sort of system that's similar to the one explained here. We also hear about a number of Tony Hawk style mission objectives for each stage too. There are objectives to the fights, but I wouldn't say that they encourage the player to use their environments or learn where things are like the original idea had planned. Instead, it's usually the number of damage done or your health left remaining. Comparing these objectives to Tony Hawk style mission objectives, which were usually great, is definitely a reach. Backyard Wrestling did not compete with any Tony Hawk game, although I'm sure the action sport market was really what they were trying to capture with this statement. The last feature to point out in this article is the system they created to show wear and tear on a wrestler's body. This one did make it into the game, but it feels a lot jankier than what was initially described. Yes, there are changes to the wrestler's appearance as time goes on, but it's always the same place and change. For example, if I hit someone in the head with a chair, their head texture might change to a more bloodied face. If I use a light bulb or some sort of glass, the texture will still change, but it'll be the same bloodied face and not one with glass shards sticking out. I don't think I saw any thumbtacks in the game when I played through it, but with the graphics, maybe I just missed them. April of 2003 was pretty quiet, with not much new information, if any at all. The team was in crunch mode and preparing for E3 and release that same year. In May of 2003, Eidos announces a sweepstakes through IGN that would allow fans to enter for a chance to be playable in the game. According to Kevin Gill, the winner of the sweepstakes was none other than the random character that we know and love today, Josh Aspel. Josh was apparently a juggalo who won the contest, which is why he's wearing a Hatchet Man shirt in the final build. Josh was also absent in most of the pre-release builds of the game, which makes sense given he wasn't selected until mid-development. Second prize won the entire Backyard Wrestling library on DVD, and third place won the coolest prize, which was a signed ICP album, The Wraith. Classic. Also in May of 2003 was E3. Eidos was bringing Backyard Wrestling, and not only were they bringing Backyard Wrestling, they also brought many of the real backyard wrestlers that would be featured in the game, and an entire wrestling ring. Footage from this event is pretty scarce, but I was able to find this. They had a wrestling ring, popular wrestlers from the game, and ICP was apparently in attendance signing pictures. Apparently, according to Kevin Gill in an interview on Facebook, ICP and Vin Diesel were doing signings at the same time, and ICP's line was double in length. This is important to note because it was a clear indication that Eidos in Backyard Wrestling made a smart move by partnering with ICP. The Juggalo market has a ton of overlap with the wrestling market. ICP themselves treat their gimmick as if they were wrestlers, and they have a true passion for wrestling, and it shows not only through their music, but through their merchandise too. They understood not only the business of wrestling, but the fans as well. I used this interview for a ton of information for this video, and I'll link it in the description. Shout out to Kevin Gill for this one. In the same interview, Kevin showed off the belt that the wrestlers fought for at E3. According to him, M-Dog 20 was the winner and crowned Backyard Champion at E3. It was a 3-day wrestling tournament that had 3 matches each day, leading up to the championship match. I wish more footage from this event existed. In addition to the E3 booth setup and the sweepstakes, and all of the other crazy things happening around Backyard Wrestling at the time, I found a ton of gameplay footage, and there's a few things to highlight because looking back, we can see what changes were made in development to the future final release. I was able to find gameplay on a pre-E3 build around February 2003, an E3 build around May of 2003, and then a preview build from after E3 before the commercial release. Check out some of the differences as development continued on Backyard Wrestling. Throughout the development of Backyard Wrestling, minor things changed like text, health bar colors, and a few other things, but there are some interesting things that we can see that didn't make it into the commercial release of the game. In the pre-E3 build, you can see that a mansion map in particular was initially set to daytime, which would be switched to nighttime in the commercial release. There's also some additional NPCs in the mansion map that do not make it into the final release. In the E3 gameplay footage, you can see additional changes like text and colors, but in this gameplay footage there seems to be a character that was either cut or put into a different character. In this footage, for a split second, you can see a character named Jackson. I'm not sure if this is a cut character, or if this is actually the character Masked Mike that did eventually make his way into the final build. In the preview builds that were given out after E3, a few more minor changes can be seen. The reversal flash is a different color, and when a wrestler has their special move, they flash blue instead of the commercial release of the wrestler's health bar flashing red. Loading screens at this point were also different. In the endgame, we see a Polaroid style picture, whereas in this build, the matchup screens were different. The final build of the game, or commercial release, did not have a character named Jackson, and the mansion map that was used was switched to nighttime. The game stayed pretty much the same throughout development, with obvious tweaks to animations, user interface, and other small changes. Outside of these development changes, in the summer of 2003, updates were pretty slow. There were a few previews through gaming media in July, and marketing for a Backyard Wrestling game website began. I found that the website is actually dated well before August of 2003, so I'm not sure why they decided to market it at this time and not earlier. In September of 2003, GameSpot began posting developer diaries, which would include a look at the development of Backyard Wrestling Don't Try This at Home. These developer diaries would continue into October and up to the game's release. The diaries usually included information about where they were at with Backyard Wrestling and some of the challenges they faced. The first one in particular reads like a shoot on Vince McMahon, and challenges including porting the game to Xbox and just overall testing. Around this time, we also learn about some pretty cool gift tie-ins for pre-ordering or purchasing from a certain retailer, which is pretty cool. On October 7th, 2003, Backyard Wrestling releases to the public. The game was met with decent fan reception, but critics and popular gaming mediums were not too fond of it. In this review by IGN, the game receives direct comparisons to popular WWE games at the time, which is wrong in my opinion, thinking back to the initial Power Stone comparisons that I pointed out before. However, regardless of critical reception, I would say this game has developed somewhat of a cult following status and is seen as a classic by many. As of the recording of this video, Backyard Wrestling has sold over 500,000 copies. You won't find it on many people's best games of all time list, but I would be willing to bet any gamer from this time has fond memories of either renting this game or playing it with your friends. Thanks for watching. I had a blast making this one. I recommend the rabbit hole that is Backyard Wrestling. There's some really interesting documentaries and videos on YouTube on the topic. If you want to see a breakdown of the development of Backyard Wrestling 2, There Goes the Neighborhood, let me know. If there's any game recommendations or anything to jump into next, let me know in the comments.